This video segment will focus on visual representations of Japan. And here we'd like to sort of draw attention to Takami Kuwayama's analysis of representation of Japan in American anthropology textbooks. Just to give you an introduction of who Takami Kuwayama is, he's now currently a professor of anthropology at Kwansei Gakuin University, but yeah, he's had some interesting sort of history. Okay? So he was born in Japan. He was basically raised in Japan up until university. He studied at Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, and after that he went to grad school in the United States. He studied at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, and he did his PhD in anthropology there. And when he was a graduate student at UCLA, he started sort of teaching undergraduate classes there, and this book and this analysis of American anthropology textbooks kind of goes back to his these earlier experiences of teaching anthropology to American university students. And after finishing his PhD at UCLA, he moved on to teach anthropology in American universities, American colleges, and he was basically, he suggested he was kind of basically tired and a bit sick of, a bit exhausted sort of with teaching in America, and he came back to Japan. Okay, and he was teaching in university in Tokyo before one private university in Tokyo before moving to Hokkaido University and then later Kwansei Gakuin University. Yeah, he was trained within American anthropology, and one of the concerns that he raises in this book, Native Anthropology, is the marginality of Japan anthropology in anthropology as a whole, sort of, in the United States. America, the United States of America, US, has the largest community of anthropologists, so it's a very, very big community, but he finds that Japan anthropology is kind of a marginalized field within anthropology. And he suggests, for example, that the panels on Japan anthropology tends to be either on the first day or the last day of the American Anthropological Association conferences. The American Anthropological Association is, again, the biggest association of anthropologists in the world, and they have big annual conference every year. In the United States or Canada, I think sometimes it could be held outside of the US, but in Canada, for example, but it's an annual, they have an annual conference, which is huge in big hotels, but it goes over 4 to 5 days. It's huge, but apparently the Japan anthropology panels tend not to be on the core days, which would be perhaps like day 2, 3, 4, rather than the first day or the last day. And also he's concerned that in major sort of anthropology kind of maybe journal articles and so forth, Japan, the kinds of sort of this from the anthropology of Japan are not always represented. This has led to his sort of, I think, research into the textbooks in American anthropology, and there are quite a few sort of major sort of textbook publishers in the U.S. that publish that sell quite a few sort of anthropology textbooks. They might cost like $100 or so. There are of course a lot of secondhand kind of, I think, textbooks available, but they're also kind of revised almost every year to sell, of course, better. And I think these textbooks, as Kuwayama argues, would be a good source to look at. to see how American anthropology tries to shape itself. Okay? And he finds that these American anthropology textbooks often represent Japan as so-called exotic other. This goes together with the idea of Orientalism. But let me go through what Kuwayama has written. So Kuwayama has sort of looked into the topics, the themes that where Japan appears in the American anthropology textbooks. Okay? So one of the themes that would include cases from Japan, according to him, is the topic of psychology, socialization, and education. And this theme of psychology, socialization, education might be a kind of classic theme within American anthropology. And yeah, one of the best known sort of theorists and well-known sort of anthropologists coming from this sort of area of psychology, socialization, education is Ruth Benedict. Okay? Ruth Benedict is famous for her book on Chrysanthemum and the Sword, and this is seen as a bit of a classic. One of the things that she brings out in this book is trying to look at patterns of Japanese culture and contrasting Japan against the West. So, for example, there's this sort of idea of Western individualism being contrasted against Japanese collectivism, and this kind of binary kind of opposition is now, I think, seen as outdated. But in American anthropology textbooks, this kind of classic sort of idea is brought in, and of course, Ruth Benedict did quite an interesting and I think well kind of read study on the Japanese. So the Japanese sort of example comes in a lot here. Benedict is also known to have been a student of Franz Boas, who is Franz Boas is seen as one of the founders of American anthropology. He was a German immigrant to the U.S., but he was known for very much sort of promoting the idea of cultural relativism. And Franz Boas was teaching at Columbia University. And at Columbia, he taught Ruth Benedict. Okay? So Ruth Benedict is kind of one of the children, the founder of American anthropology. So it's no surprise that her work, of course, gets quoted in a lot of American anthropology textbooks. Okay? But she also represents the so-called culture and personality school. This is a kind of school or scholarly tradition within American anthropology that has tried to connect culture with personality traits. And that was exactly what Ruth Benedict was doing in this Chrysanthemum and the Sword book. But nowadays, we understand in both American anthropology and within anthropology as a whole that culture and personality school is considered outdated. That it's sort of, it involves overgeneralization of a culture and personality characteristics of the people in that culture. Because Japan is given as an example under this theme, this sort of binary opposition thing might stick to the heads of the readers, the students who are reading these textbooks. So this sort of idea of Japanese collectivism is very much emphasized in this kind of representation. But Kuwayama also finds that in order to avoid over maybe essentialist kind of representations, over generalized representations, some of these texts in the textbooks would perhaps include cautionary notes pointing to social conflicts that also exist in Japan. Okay? So rather than just emphasizing the harmony aspect of Japanese culture, which comes out of Ruth Benedict's work, the textbooks would kind of make a note about how social conflicts have also existed in Japan, for example, during wartime, as well as in post-war years when there were a lot of student movements going on, and so forth. Another popular theme where Japan kind of features in American anthropology textbooks, according to Koyama, is the topic of language. And yeah, one of the things that's featured within this sort of topic of language is, for example, the writing system. And often how this Japan has this sort of quite unique maybe character system, bringing in the kanji, Chinese characters, and then also the phonetic characters of hiragana and katakana, this mixture of quite complicated writing system, which seems, of course, very different from the alphabet system that the readers are used to, is often taken up. The use of keigo honorifics, which again I think might be seen as an element that seems different from what American students might be used to, is often taken up. Another popular topic within the realm of the language is taking up this sort of distinct style of non-verbal communication, like bowing in Japan. And this photo of, for example, Japanese women bowing, and sort of probably like tea ceremony kind of context, is from an actual sort of American anthropology textbook from 1990s. Okay, so not so recent, but also not so old either. Okay, because of course by 1990s there weren't so many people wearing kimono out there, okay, in Japanese society. So there's something maybe problematic about sort of bringing out this really sort of old kind of maybe style, kind of traditional kind of culture in talking about the nonverbal communication styles. Okay? Of course, there's something true about how Japanese people bow, but yeah, does this photo like rightly represent the kind of nonverbal communication found in Japan? I'm not too sure. Another topic that Japan features might be marriage and family. This is a big topic within anthropology itself. So every anthropology textbook would have a chapter or two on, I think, kinship, marriage, family. But this is one photo that again comes from I think a 1990s textbook, a photo featuring arranged marriage called omiai in Japanese. And this is interesting because by 1990s or so, when this photo was used in an American anthropology textbook, arranged marriage was no longer a kind of norm. And Western ideals of romantic marriage had already come into Japan decades ago. But it's kind of interesting that this kind of maybe outdated, old-fashioned idea of omiai, with this sort of very classic photo of the fathers kind of greeting each other without the presence of the ones getting actually married, with all this sort of very classic curtain in the back. This, yeah, again, old kind of, I think, image might feature. So if wedding photos are used in anthropology textbooks, again, Koyama finds also that the wedding photos of Shinto-style marriages might often feature rather than Western-style weddings with a white dress and a suit kind of thing, which is actually much more common in Japan. There are much fewer couples that would have Shinto-style, old-style, kimono-style weddings, but the photos that you would perhaps find in American anthropology textbooks on Japanese weddings would perhaps feature this kimono style more. Also, the ES system, the household system, that is thought to sort of represent some of the old style kind of family ideals, often is featured under this topic. So it's a little bit, it's quite perhaps doubtful whether these kinds of representations might actually be representing contemporary Japan. And Koyama also problematizes the use of photos in American anthropology textbooks. So, for example, he finds that the duality of the Japanese are being emphasized. Often there's this sort of coexistence of traditionalism, something very old and something quite I think perhaps modern and postmodern, even being perhaps emphasized sometimes, that Japan is both traditional and also on the one hand, and it's also very progressive and postmodern and very technologically oriented on the other, very materialistic on the other kind of thing, is quite often perhaps found in a lot of visual representations, certainly. But even in the anthropology textbooks, this kind of duality might be emphasized. So one example here is this coexistence of these women clad in kimono, again practicing tea ceremony, and the sort of violent men during the Second World War, representing militaristic Japan, very masculine perhaps oriented, being sort of put together. So this kind of presents a kind of maybe ambivalent, very contradictory kind of picture of Japan. And when women are used in this kind of way to represent traditional culture, there's perhaps an Orientalist gaze here. Orientalism is kind of this idea of the West representing the East as being backward and exotic, and here women are exotified and also represented as being backward too, because of the kimono, for example, that is being used here. And maybe men, if they are sort of seen as samurai, for example, might also entail an Orientalist gaze here because of the traditionalism that's brought here, the backwardness that's brought up there, as well as the exotification. That samurai might look very different from what the Western kind of American readers might be familiar with. And Kawayama also problematizes this tendency for the textbooks to use photos often taken by commercial photographers. Nowadays, of course, I think a lot more anthropologists, actual sort of photos taken during the fieldwork might be often used. But in these cases, the photos might have been taken by commercial photographers and not anthropologists themselves. And you could argue that perhaps anthropologists might take better photos than commercial photographers, in that they can perhaps represent something from their own insights from long-term fieldwork, not something out of traditional Japan or not contemporary kind of Japan sort of thing. And one other problem that Kawayama finds is that sometimes there is a disjuncture between the text in the textbooks and the photos that are given. So one example of a photo in a textbook is this kind of photo. Again, here there's some aspect of traditionalism, considering that this is kind of celebration of the children's sort of health being celebrated in a Japanese shrine, a Shinto shrine, a jinja, a shrine. So there's some aspect of traditionalism represented here, but the caption might read something like, in industrialized societies such as Japan, most couples prefer small families. Indeed, the photo does show a small family here, but it's not like an everyday kind of setting, right? So whether this kind of brings out this image of industrialized societies is perhaps questionable here. So this is a case of a bit of a disjuncture between text and photos. And this disjuncture might become a problem because, according to Kawayama, Kawayama sort of suggests that people seem to be affected more by photos. So there is a symbolic significance of photos that might be bigger than the statistical significance. So the visual matters more than the number in terms of text. So people seem to be more affected by the visual rather than the textual. It's, I think, one of the points here And indeed, maybe the visual might stick to your head more than the text. So when students see a photo and a text, the student might remember the photo more than the text. And if the photo represents something traditional, again, okay, that traditional aspect might stay in the student's head over something, over an update that's perhaps made in the text. Also, Kawayama finds that often cultures are essentialized. So essentialism is problematizing this idea of representing a culture as something static and not really open to cultural changes. So if you essentialize a culture, that means that you kind of give a very static non-transformative, not changing kind of aspect of a culture. So you might stamp a kind of very static picture of a culture by using perhaps old photos. Also, you might find invention of tradition here. Okay, this draws on Hobsbawm's idea, which is not only about Japan again, but one example from invention of tradition is martial arts in Japan. But basically, invention of tradition means that tradition that we know of might have been invented or reinvented in modernity. So it's only when, let's say, a country or a culture like Japan became a modern state that people start thinking of traditions. Okay? So traditions are kind of created as an antithesis of some sort or as a contrast to modernity that we're part of. Okay? So it's only when modernity starts that traditions are kind of created. Okay? And when modernity starts, especially in the case of Japan, when Japan became a modern state, this was through Meiji Restoration and rise of westernization in Japan. The more that Japan was trying to westernize, also going back to sort of tradition also came about, and this is when invention of tradition might happen. Okay? So martial arts, for example, judo was kind of a case of invented tradition in Meiji period, and it became a kind of, it's become a global sport of some sort by now. But you could also find that maybe kabuki theater was also reinvented in Japan's modernity, and so forth. Okay, so invention of tradition might be something that's perhaps quite commonly found, but also widely represented in the American anthropology textbooks. Okay? And Kawayama is concerned that perhaps American anthropology textbooks don't do much better than mass media tourism, okay? Because, well, we expect that at least anthropology textbooks represent cultures in a better way than how mass media might do so, or how guidebooks that travelers might take up might do. But he finds that, well, American anthropology textbooks seem to be doing something very similar to what mass media or touristic guides might be doing. And he problematizes the feminization of the other. This relates to the Orientalist gaze, but from a very male-centric kind of perspective, women are considered the other, and on top of that, gay women can often be under Orientalist gaze. Okay, so exotified and seen as old, fashioned, representing traditionalism and so forth. Okay, so we find that, for example, a lot of the photos that I've shared with you that comes from Kawayama's chapter have represented Japanese women clad in kimono, and this is the case of feminization of the other that Kawayama problematizes. And some of the readers, especially perhaps the female American anthropology students, might think, oh, look at how the women are treated in these other cultures. compared to us, there's maybe a lot of room for gender equality in other cultures. They might feel like better about the position of women in their own society, and this is a problem because anthropology tries to promote this idea of cultural relativism. Okay? Cultural relativism basically works under the assumption that cultures are different and cultures should not be judged from ethnocentric perspective. And this is a very important principle for anthropology. But if you go culturally relativistic too much, perhaps you might pay too much attention to the differences between cultures, and too much emphasis on cultural relativism might be blinding anthropologists to similarities across human cultures because you pay too much attention to the differences. And Kawayama again is concerned that despite the ideals of cultural relativism, which is supposed to go against ethnocentrism, the textbooks may inadvertently perhaps help American student readers portray themselves in a positive light. So they read something again about Japanese women being clad in kimono, being caught in kind of traditionalism, and they might feel like, oh, I'm so glad I'm in the United States. I don't have to experience the struggles that women in Japan might have. And this is kind of not what anthropology is supposed to do. Okay? Anthropology is supposed to bring out the opposite of trying to become open-minded and trying to sort of respect diversity and not judge other cultures. But these textbooks might be bringing out a kind of wrong message. Okay? Of course, perhaps Kawayama is perhaps being overly critical of American anthropology textbooks here, but I hope that this discussion has helped you perhaps rethink how Japan and Japanese people might be represented in other spheres, okay, including the media, TV, social media, mass media, and so forth.